In this nugget, we're going to look at the key context to the poem The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson, and we're going to think about how this relates to the writer's intentions. The poem is set during the Crimean War. The Charge of the Light Brigade is about a British military disaster which took place during the Crimean War during the 1850s. The poem was published in the year 1854. It was a military disaster because the British Army generals ordered the Light Brigade, who were 600 men on horseback, armed with lances or spears and sabres or swords, and they were ordered to attack the Russian forces by charging into a valley. However, due to a miscommunication of orders, the Light Brigade were sent to attack the wrong unit of Russians, one that was armed with heavy artillery, guns and cannons. This led to hundreds of the British men and their horses being slaughtered, and so the event came to be known as a national tragedy. When the British people read about the tragedy of the Light Brigade in the newspapers, they were outraged at the mistake. They felt the soldiers had behaved bravely and nobly, but that the generals had made an unforgivable blunder. And this is referenced in the poem in the lines, "Not though the soldiers knew, someone had blundered." So who was Alfred Lord Tennyson? He was a Victorian poet, born in 1809 and died in 1892. In the year 1850, he was appointed to the title of Poet Laureate. To be chosen as Poet Laureate was a great honour. It meant you were the nation's poet, and so you had to write poetry that appealed to the national spirit. The Charge of the Light Brigade is a very good example of a poem that appeals to the national spirit, because, in it, Tennyson captures the mood of the country at the time by criticising the blunder of those in power and glorifying the soldiers as heroes, which we can see in lines such as, "Honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. So what were Tennyson's main intentions in the poem? Firstly, he wanted to glorify the brave soldiers and to show their heroism, which we can see in the quote, "Boldly they rode," and the quote, "Horse and hero fell." Secondly, in the poem he wanted to honour the soldiers and to keep their memory alive, which we can see in the final lines of the poem, "Honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. Finally, he also wanted to use the poem to critique the government, politicians and the army generals who were so careless with the soldiers' lives, which we can see in the line, "Someone had blundered." Remember, whenever you include context or talk about the writer's intentions, you should link your ideas to a quotation from the poem, and that way you'll know you're making relevant contextual points. We're going to look at an example of a written answer which does exactly this. Throughout the poem, Tennyson glorifies the soldiers as heroes, describing how they rode boldly and bravely into battle. His presentation of the soldiers as heroic fits the national mood at the time. Hearing about the tragedy in the newspapers, many British people were outraged by the blunder, but felt proud of the noble sacrifice that the soldiers had made. In this poem, Tennyson captures this national mood, and so he praises the courage of the Light Brigade. So what makes this a successful answer? Firstly, the candidate has used context when they say, hearing about the tragedy in newspapers, many British people were outraged by the blunder, but felt proud of the noble sacrifice that the soldiers had made. They also talk about the writer's intentions, saying that in this poem, Tennyson captures the national mood and praises the courage of the Light Brigade. They support their ideas using quotations boldly and noble.